Good morning. I'm Kelly Atley, Director of Public Relations and Communications for Foundation Health Partners. Thank you for joining us today. Foundation Health Partners is proud to be the lead sponsor for today's Go Red event. And thank you for joining us for this community conversation. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please remember to keep your mic muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions, we hope you do, please put them in the chat box and Dr. Mangum will answer them at the end of the session. Also, a quick reminder that this year's main Go Red event is next Friday, February 26th from noon to 1. I hope you can join us. Now, in keeping with Go Red's goal of raising awareness for heart disease among women and encouraging action that saves lives, Dr. Sally Mangum will be sharing lifestyle strategies to protect yourself from cardiovascular disease. Dr. Mangum is a graduate of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she completed her PhD in biochemistry at UAF in 2010. She joined the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a research scientist investigating compounds found in wild foods and bioactive potentials. Her research is rooted in nutrition and has focused on molecular targets of inflammation, vitamin D metabolism, and understanding of insulin resistance. She received her medical degree from the Pacific Northwest University of Health Sciences and did her medical residency at Good Samaritan Hospital in Corvallis, Oregon. She returned home to Fairbanks and joined Foundation Health Partners Tanana Valley Clinic as a primary care physician in 2019. She is board certified in internal medicine and is currently working towards her certification with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Dr. Mangum's passion lies in preventative health, and through her social media presence, where she's known as Dr. Sally, she offers a collection of evidence-based information on lifestyle strategies for optimizing metabolic health and preventing disease. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Sally Mangum.
Good morning. There are two other people in the room with me right now that are masked and social distance. They're also behind a barrier, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my mask for this presentation. Thank you for having me. I'm here today to talk about the leading cause of death in women and to empower you to change the current status quo. This is a topic that's dear to me, not only as a mother, as a daughter, but also as a physician, because every 80 seconds, a woman dies from cardiovascular disease. When I talk about these conditions, this includes more than just heart attack. This includes valve problems of the heart, arrhythmias, coronary artery disease. It includes heart failure and infections of the heart as well. The vascular aspect of this includes hypertension or elevated blood pressure, as well as stroke. These are conditions that don't always stare back at us in the mirror. In fact, they can be disguised and compensated for several years. I think it's important to note that 50% of women listening to this presentation today have or will have at least one form of cardiovascular disease in their lifetime, and 1 out of every 3 will die from it. So how do you know if you're at risk? It turns out that the same factors that are pertinent to cardiovascular risk are also relevant for metabolic syndrome. In fact, there's key metabolic dysregulations that we know collectively lead to a syndrome called metabolic syndrome. These include high blood pressure, insulin resistance, suboptimal cholesterol levels, and being a medically unhealthy body weight. In addition, cardiovascular risk factors rest on age, gender, substance abuse, as well as family history. In this slide, what we see is that those with metabolic syndrome on the pink line have increased rates or risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. This is in comparison to those without metabolic syndrome. It turns out that this intersection between metabolic dysregulation and increased risk for cardiovascular disease is the perfect target, not only for pharmaceutical intervention, but also for lifestyle interventions. Over the last decade, we've really seen huge advancements in pharmaceutical interventions in targeting these metabolic dysregulations in order to improve cardiovascular health. In 2015, we saw new medications emerge that were effective at lowering lipid levels, including cholesterol and LDL. In 2018, we saw several new weight loss medications that were assessed for their cardiovascular safety. And in 2019, we saw certain diabetes medications being studied not only for their role at reducing glucose levels in the bloodstream, but also helping people to lose weight and improving their cardiovascular outcomes. These diabetes medications have really changed the way that we manage diabetes, especially in the outpatient setting. The two classes that have been shown to be beneficial for cardiovascular health are the GLP-1 receptor agonist and the SGLT2 inhibitors. These are medicines that you might have seen in commercials, and the most common ones that I use in the clinic are listed at the bottom of the screen. I'll first talk briefly about the GLP-1 receptor agonist, otherwise known as Victoza, Trulicity, and Ozempic. These medicines really target the GI tract to slow things down, so they help people to feel full for longer, and in turn, they don't take as much food in. These people that are on these medicines typically lose weight, which can improve their blood pressure and decrease inflammation in their bodies overall. This leads to improved cardiovascular health. The SGLT2 inhibitors basically act on the kidney, where they tell the kidney not to hold on to all the glucose in your bloodstream, but to empty it and excrete it through the urinary system. When we don't hold on to those sugars in our bloodstream, it's less likely that we're going to store them as fat. And so people tend to lose weight with these medications. Again, improving blood pressure, decreasing inflammation in the body, and in turn, improving cardiovascular health. These medicines aren't for everybody, but I would encourage you that if you're living with diabetes, and especially if you have one or more cardiovascular risk factors, that you talk to your doctor about considering these medications. Before we move from pharmaceutical intervention to lifestyle intervention, I want to spend a few minutes talking about risk factors that are unique to women. These include pregnancy-related risk factors, including gestational hypertension, otherwise known as elevated blood pressure during pregnancy or preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and even preterm delivery. Breast cancer therapies such as radiation, as well as different chemotherapy agents, have also been shown to increase risk, as well as early onset menopause, whether it's from surgical reasons, medication-induced, or from natural causes, can also increase risk. Lastly, autoimmune conditions or rheumatologic diseases that are more prevalent in women, they put us at increased risk as well. Keep in mind, this is in addition to the typical risk factors that I mentioned on the last slide that are both pertinent to men and to women. I'd like to pause here to pose a question. I'd like to ask, how many of you, whether leaving your OBGYN's office in your 20s or 30s, or leaving your doctor's office at any age, how many of you knew when your last gynecologic exam was? When your next mammogram would be? How many of you knew what your options were for birth control or hormone replacement therapy? Next, I'd like to ask you, was your blood pressure in normal range? Did you have a cholesterol panel done? And did you know if you were at risk for insulin resistance? What I'm getting to is I'd like you to think about when you left your doctor's office last, did you know if your heart was healthy? I know for personal experience that many women, especially during their childbearing years, tend to view their OBGYN as their primary care provider. For this reason, OBGYNs have become integral in the health of our communities, assessing women during childbearing years and beyond to determine if they have these risk factors, and then guiding them to establish with primary doctors, and in some cases, sending them directly to cardiology. We've seen even that certain programs have implemented programs throughout the OBGYN communities in order to identify these women and have them get really close follow-up with other providers. So what do you need to ask your doctor at your next visit? I encourage you to have a conversation about what a medically healthy weight is for you. Know your blood pressure. Is it within normal range? And what can you do to decrease that level if it's not? Ask for a cholesterol panel. Look at your fasting blood glucose on your metabolic panel, or ask to have an A1C done to know if you've developed insulin resistance or if you have prediabetes or diabetes. With this information, you can have calculated your risk score for cardiovascular disease, either a 10-year risk score or 30-year risk score. And this can be calculated by your provider. This is extremely important for this condition because 80% of cardiovascular disease is preventable by modern medicine and lifestyle intervention. Once you know your risk, the next step is determining your motivation to improve specific risk factors. This might be for self-improvement or in order to spend more time with your grandchildren. Some people find that making changes to improve their risk factors can improve their overall well-being and also utilize less resources long-term. Obesity is a worldwide risk to health. It's not just the number on the scale that matters, but really these metabolic dysregulations that accompany obesity are what lead to disease onset and progression. In fact, the National Institute of Health has shared that up to 60% of American adults are overweight, with 35% of them being obese. The trend tells us that by 2030, 50% of Americans will be obese. I'd like to mention also that this is despite 67% of women being on a restrictive eating plan annually for weight loss. What's clear is that something does not add up. The current lifestyle that we're living is not translating into longevity or long-term health. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This brings us to my favorite topic, which is lifestyle strategies for optimizing health and preventing disease. These strategies sometimes look a bit overwhelming and can take a little bit more time up front, especially when you're comparing them to taking medications for certain conditions. The truth is, though, is they have far less side effects. Oftentimes, they're better for the planet, and they're far less expensive than having a cardiovascular event. I love that the American College of Cardiology, as well as the American Heart Association, has really implemented these lifestyle strategies in promotion of improving cardiovascular health. The truth is that they really parallel a lot of the specialties in medicine who promote lifestyle intervention, and most of them do. Most subspecialties in medicine promote lifestyle intervention as the first-line therapy for most conditions. Sometimes that's alone, but other times it's in addition to medications. My favorite, though, is Dean Ornish's mantra of eat well, move more, stress less, and love more. What we eat affects us on a cellular level. It influences our metabolic pathways, our gut microbiome, and influences our hormone regulation as well. This is a really complex slide, but the point is that the food we put in really influences all of these pathways, from circulation to cognitive function, and even to hormone release or inhibition. Most of us, when we think about diet, we think about a special course of food that we restrict ourselves to in order to either lose weight or for a medical reason. This is a concept that diet culture has really perpetuated and taken advantage of. And I'd encourage you instead to consider the alternative definition of diet, which is the kinds of food that a person or community habitually eats. The point is that tracking every point or every food indefinitely or living in ketosis for the rest of your life is just not sustainable. If it was, then the numbers I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation wouldn't be true. In a recent review in the journal Nutrition, the authors looked at different macronutrient ratios, time-restricted eating, and different restrictive diets in order to determine which was best for weight loss. What they found when they looked at this both short-term and long-term is that it didn't really matter what program people were following. It was partly true that for quicker weight loss, a high protein and lower carb diet did show some benefit short-term, but this didn't end up being true long-term. In fact, the factors for success for long-term included adherence, negative energy balance, and eating high quality, or what I refer to as nutrient-dense foods. When we think about habits surrounding our day-to-day lives, as well as how we fuel our bodies, it's really this adherence piece that helps us to cultivate our lifestyle. So if we're looking for a long-term plan that's sustainable and has health benefit, what questions should we be asking? And which one is best for our overall health? We can look at this a few different ways. We can ask questions like, which diet is best for the planet? Or which diet helps prevent disease or reverse disease? We can also look at what types of foods or diet plans help to prevent specific types of disease, like cardiovascular disease. And lastly, we can look at communities all over the world and we can ask, what are people eating in these communities where they're living the longest? We can look at these things individually, or we can look at them holistically. And when we look at them holistically, what we find is that eating plant proteins and fat lead to decreased mortality rates compared to those who eat animal predominant diets. Also, those who eat more processed foods and more animal proteins tend to live shorter lives. Lastly, eating a vegetarian diet has been shown to be best for the environment. Looking at this collectively is what allows us to develop these guidelines, like this one by the American College of Cardiology, that emphasizes heart-healthy diets such as DASH, Mediterranean, and vegetarian plans. Notice here that the specific dietary intake recommendations for women include lots of whole foods. It's plant predominant. They also recommend eating lower amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol in your diet. This parallels that of the blue zones, where we see these food guidelines in this pyramid here that look much different than the pyramid we grew up with. What we see is at the bottom of the pyramid, they're really emphasizing a plant predominant diet. But I'd like you to also take note that this includes fish, eggs, as well as meat. In fact, people that live to be close to 100 do eat meat approximately 5 times per month. I didn't see Dr. Ren's presentation, but for those of you that know him or have seen him as a patient or saw his presentation, probably think that I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. As a fellow Alaskan, I just want to say that in my household, we also eat fish and moose. In fact, I want you to keep in mind that eating wild game or natural resources is always superior to eating processed foods. If you're somebody that struggles with elevated cholesterol levels, then it's very important to decrease your amount of saturated fat intake. And we typically get these saturated fats through animal proteins. So what I would encourage you to do is come up with a plan to limit these things in your diet, but also to look at the saturated fat content and to make decisions about what you eat based on that, choosing the ones that have lower contents of saturated fats. The next piece of this when we look at nutrition is that it's not just about what we eat, but also about when we eat. In this article by the New England Journal of Medicine, what we see is that there's several metabolic benefits of intermittent fasting beyond just weight loss. What we found is that routine fasting can actually lead to neurocognitive benefits, lower blood pressures, improved insulin sensitivity, reduced cholesterol levels, and decreasing overall inflammation in the body. Some of these things probably sound familiar because these are all the targets that we're looking at in order to improve our cardiovascular risk. This article details some of the programs or recommendations for how to implement fasting into your routine lifestyle. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. In this slide here, what we see at the top is a typical American eating pattern. The red arrows are indications of when somebody eats. And every single time this person eats, their glucose levels spike. Now, through normal physiology, what happens when our glucose levels go up is that our pancreas releases insulin. And this is what it's supposed to do. Insulin basically tells our body to drive this glucose into our cells so that we can either burn it or store it as fat. What you can see is that the more times you spike your glucose, the more times you're going to release insulin. And this basically promotes fat storage. I like to think of the fed state, which is what we see here in the typical American eating plan, as the storage state. We're going to compare this to somebody that participates in intermittent fasting. In this cycle, what we see is that there's periods where the person is not eating and the glucose is not spiking. Then we have periods of eating or eating windows where the glucose is going up. Again, the insulin would go up and drive the sugar into the cells to be used or stored. After this, what happens? After you eat your last meal, approximately 8 to 12 hours later, there's a metabolic switch that occurs that allows your body to start burning fatty acids from your liver and then burning fat stores. So we see in this second graph that really there's time for this fasting state as well as a burning state. What we see is that in the fasted state, this promotes fat metabolism and can improve insulin sensitivity. Imagine if your cells are really bombarded every single day by having to take up this glucose, then they get tired over time and they start to develop resistance. They're not utilizing their nutrients as well. And what happens is this glucose ends up hanging around in your bloodstream. And this is what leads to elevated glucose levels, prediabetes, and even diabetes. The next graph here is one that has longer duration of fasting. I don't recommend this for people that are starting fasting, but this is for people that are a little bit more advanced in the practice. In this strategy, which is known as alternate day fasting, there's a longer fasting period that allows for increased number of hours where you're in that burning mode. I'd like to mention that the New England Medical Journal article, as well as my typical recommendations for patients starting out fasting, are to start with a 12-hour fast. And this includes the nighttime hours as well. So this might be 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. or 10 p.m. to 10 a.m., whatever fits into your lifestyle. Then, once you've established that on most days of the week, trying to extend that up to 14 hours or 18 hours, just a few days a week, can provide benefit, not only for weight loss, but also to improve insulin sensitivity and for other benefits that I mentioned on the previous slide. The next steps to improving your health and preventing disease are movement and stress reduction. Moving your body improves circulation, can decrease blood pressure as well as your need for medications. It can lift your mood, it can help manage weight, promote adequate sleep, and can also reduce stress. The American College of Cardiology recommends at least 150 minutes of exercise per week. And for women, there's additional benefit in engaging in 5 hours of moderate intensity aerobic exercise weekly. Now, this idea of movement and stress reduction really overlap. Other stress reduction techniques can include things like yoga or meditation. For some, it's listening to music or journaling. And the one that I like and that I recommend, but have also implemented in my own life, is this exercise called 3 Good Things. This is a mindfulness practice where you basically train your brain once daily to consider the good things. As humans, we inherently think about the big, bad, scary, and it's really easy to get fixated on those things and to ruminate on them. By putting this practice into play, it gives us an opportunity to think about 3 good things every single day. This has been shown to have health benefits by boosting your mood, improving sleep, and several other things. It turns out that being present and working to decrease your stress level actually makes it easier for us to make conscious choices. And in turn, this improves our overall health. Furthermore, I want to mention that eating meals with people, friends, family, as well as exercising or going to yoga with them, has also been shown to have benefit. In fact, social connectivity has been shown to improve longevity as well as improve overall health. Lastly, limiting harmful substances is good for your heart. Avoiding tobacco completely and having 1 or less servings of alcohol per day or less than 7 per week is what has been recommended to be best for heart health. So in summary, what do you need to do in order to protect against cardiovascular disease? First and foremost, know your numbers. Ask for your risk. Ask for that score to be calculated. Ask for labs and know your blood pressure. Create a habitual eating habit around nutrient-dense foods. Make sure that this is also including a negative energy balance if you're trying to lose weight. And consider routine fasting, not only for weight loss, but also for metabolic optimization. Move your body, nurture your social network, and include a mindfulness practice, such as the 3 good things exercise I shared today. Next, limit substances. And if you're having difficulty with any of these things, please seek help. These are my references for today. And this is where you can find me for more information on optimizing metabolic health and preventing disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mangum. That was excellent information. We are now going to open up the session to questions. Dr. Mangum?
All right, so we have a question here about fasting. And the question is, how does somebody go about a 12-hour fast when they get lightheaded or dizzy, or when they don't eat regularly? So this is a great question. And actually in that journal article, they do talk about the fact that when you're first starting out fasting, it's very common for people to feel uncomfortable and to become lightheaded and dizzy. And some of the strategies you can do to help augment that are to make sure that you're really hydrated, as well as taking in electrolytes. So there's a few different products. There's some electrolyte powders and waters that can be really helpful. Sometimes just replenishing your electrolytes during that fasting period can really help you to feel a little bit more grounded, kind of take the edge off and get you through so you can accomplish your fast. The next question that we have is, my husband loves meat. Any recommendations on how to limit my intake? Yeah, this is a great question as well, and really challenging, especially here in Alaska, where we all love to eat meat, especially wild sources like fish and moose. So I think starting small. So some things that we've done in my household would be to have, Monday night is bean night. So we have recipes with beans without meat. And I think starting to make some small changes like that, whether it's one meal a week or maybe for lunch, having alternative protein sources such as plant-based sources, can kind of help ease you into this idea. Again, it's not an all or nothing approach. And sometimes when we get stuck in this, like I can't have meat or I can, it really is confusing. I think just looking at this to say, I want to do something that can improve my health, and limiting certain things, or maybe the quantity of them, is a great place to start. So still having meat in your diet, but maybe also having some meals with animal proteins, and then trying to look at the saturated fat in the proteins that you are taking in and choosing ones that have lower amounts of saturated fat. So the next question says, or comment actually, is about the information for 3 Good Things, and that you're going to be adding that to your routine. That's awesome. I find that this is just a great activity that really anyone can do. In fact, I even have my kids do it sometimes. So if they're just being really crazy or having a tantrum, we might kind of, give it a few minutes, but then at the end of it, I ask them to list off 3 good things that happen for the day, really to just kind of shift that mindset. The other thing that I love about it is that it's a mindfulness exercise that really causes no harm, right? So there's no harm in doing this, and it has potential to provide a lot of benefit. All right, and the next one says, best way to manage sugar cravings. Oh my goodness, this is so hard. This is one of the hardest things, and I think derails a lot of people, especially because a lot of us eat sugar during holidays or as a reward or a celebration. And so once we start eating more of it, it's kind of like this cycle we get into, and it's really hard to avoid it. I would say, though, that the fasting, intermittent fasting or routine fasting, can actually help quite a bit with this. During that period where you're in that burning mode, you can actually decrease your cravings and decrease your hunger. So that's one strategy that can be helpful. The other thing is maybe trying some of those electrolyte waters, like I mentioned. Those can just kind of curb your sweet tooth. They're sweetened with stevia or monk fruit. And so they're natural sweeteners, not artificial sweeteners. But these can really help to kind of curb that craving when you have it, so that you can kind of get beyond it and move on. The other thing is planning. So making sure you do that meal prep and having healthy snacks on hand, so that when you're tempted to eat that sugary food, you have something else already prepared to fall back on. Oh, yeah. All right, what is the optimal fasting time for women in their 50s? Great question. So rather than stating an optimal time, I think that it's just important that you're routinely fasting. So even if you're just getting in a 12-hour fast, and like I said, that's through the nighttime hours as well. So this is including the hours while you're sleeping. For most people, this looks like just not having breakfast. And you can still have black coffee, you can still have tea and water, but anything over about 30 or 40 calories will break your fast. So keeping that in mind and trying to get that 12-hour fast in routinely, I think once you feel good there about what you're doing and start to notice some changes, then you have more motivation to kind of extend that to a 14-hour fast, 16-hour fast, or maybe even an 18-hour fast once or twice a week. There's not really an optimal time per se. It's just the more often you do this routinely, the more benefit you get long-term, even if it's a shorter duration.
I think there was one more up there too.
Great. So this is a recommendation for water intake, and this can actually be a little bit tricky. Typically for most people, what you want to do is take your body weight, divide it in half, and that's how many ounces of water you should drink a day. So if you weigh 200 pounds, cut that in half, and you should be drinking 100 ounces of water a day. That sounds like a lot. And I think a good place to start is somewhere between 40 and 60 ounces, especially if you're not drinking water right now, or you're not drinking much of it. Start there and kind of work your way up. I will say though, as a disclaimer, that this becomes more tricky if you have conditions like heart failure, because in that case, your doctor or cardiologist might be recommending that you limit your water intake. So please ask your physician and they can help you determine what would be best for you specifically. All right, let me scroll through and see if there are any other questions here. When fasting, are you getting all your calories in the eating period, or are you cutting calories as well? Perfect. So this can get tricky because I definitely have seen people do routine fasting and not lose weight because they are consuming so many calories during the eating window. And this is why not everyone loses weight while fasting. Keep in mind though, you're still having a lot of those added health benefits during the fasting period, even if you're not losing weight. With that said, the reason that I talked about that journal and nutrition is because what they showed is that in order to accomplish weight loss long-term, you really need to be eating in that window of a negative energy balance. So yes, it matters. And yes, you should make sure you're getting enough calories, which your doctor can help you calculate that, or a registered dietitian would be helpful for that information as well. So make sure you're getting enough calories, and then make sure that it's coming from that nutrient-dense sources as well as low saturated fats. I will say that if you're cutting calories, again, just make sure you're getting plenty of nutrition during that eating window. If you cut things too much, then that's where you end up in a situation where your body can really kind of go into a mode where it wants to hold on to everything you put in. So eating adequate calories during that fasting window is important. All right, I'm just going to scroll through here and see if there are any other questions. And if there's anything that I said that you need clarification on, please let me know as well. Oh, black coffee, great. Yes, there's actually has been shown to be benefit in black coffee. So the question was, as I mentioned black coffee, is coffee good for women and heart health? Yeah, there's been some benefits that have been shown from drinking coffee. I will just warn you though, these benefits are typically negated if you're putting a bunch of creamer and sugar into your coffee. So beware of that. What food causes inflammation? This is a little bit different for everybody. So, and there's actually not a lot of research on it. What I'll say that we know is that obesity causes inflammation. So being a medically unhealthy weight, having elevated blood pressure and high cholesterol levels, having insulin resistance, all of those things kind of go hand in hand with inflammation. And they can increase your risk not only of heart disease, but also for different cancers. And we're seeing a lot more research coming out regarding that. Now, in terms of true inflammation in the body, like from rheumatologic diseases or inflammatory conditions, I do have patients that tell me that avoiding things like gluten or dairy for them specifically might lead to improved symptoms. But again, we don't have a lot of literature on that. So I don't have anything to say that's really evidence-based other than trying different ways of eating and seeing if this helps you to feel better is kind of the experiment you have to go through. If you had to define the worst foods, what would they be? Foods to avoid or never eat. Great. So I would say high fructose corn syrup, just avoid it at all cost. What we see is that the way that the body responds to that, those spikes in your glucose levels are just even more severe and significant. And so you have to basically release a lot more insulin in order to deal with that glucose in your bloodstream. And what happens is you just end up storing that sugar in your cells as fat. So high fructose corn syrup is, for me, I try to avoid it at all cost. If you're going to drink alcohol, what are healthier options? Well, interestingly, in the blue zones, they actually showed that people that live longer do consume some wine with meals, especially in the social setting. So I think, saying no alcohol at all is not really, doesn't really fit for everybody. One thing I would mention, though, is that when you're using alcohol, that using it every single day will inhibit you from kind of going into that metabolic switch to get into fat burning mode, because you do have to metabolize that alcohol before you metabolize your food. So that can kind of postpone your fasting period. So keep that into consideration. Also, that's kind of why I said, 1 or less drinks per day or less than 7 per week, just so that you can kind of find some strategy where you can still implement your fast, but also be maybe enjoying a few glasses of wine with friends during a meal. All right, I think that is all the questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you again, Dr. Mangum. That was truly great information. And thank you for attending.